Hello, y'all. Welcome back. This is going to be chapter 26 or XXVI of civil laws. And I would tell you, stop at page 169. Everything past that's just not all that valuable in reading. Okay, so Hobbes wants to know what are the innate laws that citizens must obey when in a commonwealth? He says, civil law is to every subject those rules which the commonwealth has commanded him, by word or writing or other sufficient sign of the will, to make use of for the distinction of right and wrong. That is to say, of that is contrary and what is not contrary to the rule. Um, so yeah, civil law is the legitimate law. Okay, so one, the legislator, no matter which commonwealth, makes the law, right? So he's making a distinction here. Number two, only the sovereign can abrogate the law. So we talked about that earlier. Under Hobbes's vision, the sovereign is not bound by the law. Number three, long known customs are assumed to be law due to the silence of the sovereign in changing them. Number four, while there are natural laws granted by God, they are synonymous with civil laws because they could never be upheld without the Commonwealth. So even those sort of religious laws that everybody follows in Europe at the time are still to be conceived of as, even those sort of natural laws by God are even to be considered sovereign laws because they could not exist. I'm sorry, this phone is driving me nuts. Because those laws could not exist without the sovereign existing itself. And he says, but the right of nature, that is, the natural liberty of man, may by the civil law be abridged and restrained. Nay, the end of making laws is no other but such restraint, without which there cannot possibly be any peace. And law was brought into the world for nothing else but to limit the natural liberty of particular men in such manner as they might not hurt, but assist one another and join together against a common enemy. So he's saying, the civil law is the whole point. You're not supposed to have 100% liberty. The whole purpose of the sovereign and of the law is to convince you to work toward the greater good rather than abusing your fellow citizen. He says those incapable of the covenant cannot be held accountable, and that there must be some sufficient knowledge of the law and able to enforce it. So, people who are, say, intellectually disabled, children, the extremely elderly and senile cannot be held to account under the law because they don't understand it, right? And they could never have made that covenant with the state. And then Hobbes lists three natural laws. The first is the golden rule, right? Do unto others. The second is that secret laws cannot count as laws, they must be public and open. And the third, the law must come from the sovereign, not just some crony of the sovereign or some person to whom he's delegated the task. Okay, chapter 27, XXVII. Of crimes, excuses, and extenuations. So here we're kind of getting into the nitty gritty about actual laws. He says you cannot have laws that criminalize a former behavior that had been legal, right? And we have that same system in the United States where you can't say, all right, we made something illegal today, say heroin use, I don't know, and you were using heroin yesterday, so you're under arrest. Like, that's not valid. You must be able to intellectually comprehend the societal covenant, right? So this is what we were talking about earlier. Children, the senile, the intellectually disabled cannot be held under the social covenant. And, this is a big argument in the Supreme Courts about being able to execute or imprison those who are clearly incapable of understanding, right? They have some sort of intellectual disability or some severe brain trauma. Anyway, so this is kind of even touchy to this day. The next one. The state must fulfill its obligation of a decent life for its citizens. When depression or famine come and a man must feed himself and his family, it is not a crime. So if the state is falling apart and if the state is causing nothing but extreme poverty, then at that point, like, you don't have a covenant with the state. You are allowed to steal to feed yourself and your family. He says premeditated crimes deserve a harsher punishment, but those that are committed emotionally should be considered as less a crime. So we do have this distinction in the United States, right, between first degree and second degree and manslaughter, murder, whatever. Those who premeditate and conceive of the act and carry it through are thought to be much more culpable than, say, a wife who gets angry and shoots her husband in self-defense or something, or shoots her husband out of just freaking out, or they're high on PCP or something and they kill somebody accidentally. That sort of thing is different than a rationalized, premeditated action. And he says, for in the former case, there is a place for extenuation in the common infirmity of human nature, right? It's human nature to get emotionally overwhelmed and to act some ways out of irrationality. But he that doth it with premeditation has used circumspection and cast his eye on the law, on the punishment, and on the consequences thereof to human society, all which in committing the crime he hath condemned and postponed to his own appetite. But there is no suddenness of passion sufficient for a total excuse. For all the time between the first knowing of the law and the commission of the fact shall be taken for a time of deliberation, because he ought by meditation of law to rectify the irregularity of his passions. So while there is a difference, even those who act in passion still have to be held before the law, right? Just not quite to the extent that those who rationally carry out an illegal act do. Okay, chapter 28. So this is XXVIII. Of punishments and rewards. And I would say here, again, stop at page 193, because after that, it's not all that valuable. Okay, so he lays down some stuff about punishments and rewards, and we're going to talk about 7 of them. I think he puts down about 12 of them, but a lot of them are sort of reiterations of former ones. Okay, number 1. Only the sovereign is allowed to dole out punishment. All else is to be considered revenge, right? So only the state has the right to dole out punishment. Number 2, being shamed by one's actions is not punishment. So if you've been socially outcast, that's not a punishment from the state. That's simply your neighbors thinking you're a dick, right? Number 3, the defendant and the trial must be public. Quote, because the fact for which a man is punished ought first to be judged by public authority to be a transgression of the law. So it must be public and it must be open. And there are a few reasons for that, right? First, so that the law is seen as legitimate. Second, so that the state can prove that they actually have evidence, right? So habeas corpus. But then third, so that the public gets some semblance of justice, right? If everything's hidden, they don't necessarily know that any justice has been done. And we know that, for the families who are victims of crimes and things of that sort, it's important and healing for them to be able to sit through a trial and see the accused be found guilty and punished, right? Okay. Number 4, judges do not have the right to punish beyond the law, as they do not have the sovereign's authority to do so, and the defendant never agreed to that in the social covenant. Number 5, if there is no intent to reform the defendant or make his case a warning to the public, it is not punishment, but an act of hostility, right? So there has to be a larger social purpose in the punishment for it to be legitimate, right? And the state, if the defendant is can be reformed, the state has an obligation to do that. Number 6, if someone dies due to their criminal actions, it may be said to be divine, but not punishment. I thought that was weird, but number 11, anyone who declares himself outside of the covenant is a traitor and shall be punished. Okay, we will stop it there. And you know what? We're not. There's only one more chapter left, so I will keep going. So the final chapter, this is chapter 29, XXIX, of those things that weaken or tend to the dissolution of the commonwealth, right? So we talked a couple chapters ago about how we strengthen the commonwealth. These are the things that he thinks can doom a commonwealth. Number 1, the sovereign not taking enough power. This tends to bring rebellion in the power vacuum. So he's saying that some dictators or monarchs or whatever are too willing to delegate power to others, and that comes back to bite them in the ass. Number 2, seditious doctrines. So he's saying that the following list is sort of a bunch of seditious doctrines against the state. The first, that every private man is judge of good and evil actions. He says that is not true. That is the state's and the court's right to decide what is good and what is not. We'll move on to D, the idea that the sovereign is subject to his own laws. For some, for some reason, Hobbes seems to think that if the king is subject to his own laws, then that's going to bring about the dissolution of the state. I got real problems with that one. E, the idea that citizens have a complete right to privacy and property even over the sovereign, right? So the sovereign takes supremacy over the citizen under his conception. F, division of powers. He says the division of powers can actually cause the dissolution of a state. And, of course, we would point out that the American founders were very antithetical to this idea, as are most modern Western democracies, that there have to be some sort of checks and balances, right, for rule of law to actually exist. G, allowing the youth and the educated to read the Greek and Roman histories which laud the assassination of tyrants. So he goes on this whole spiel about allowing people to read the Greek and Roman histories, wherein the citizens quite often depose or assassinate or murder, as in the case of, say, Caesar, the sovereign, right? And that they were doing so because the sovereign was a dictator or tyrannical or unjust or whatever you want to call it. But he says, look, that's a problem, right? We don't need all these kids and philosophers and well-read people to just be thinking like that's a heroic action to overthrow your leader. So leaders should think about not allowing people to read that stuff. Okay, H. He warns that there's a fine line to walk when taxing the people, right? So you have this sort of spectrum from hard enforcement to soft enforcement. And he said if you enforce taxes too hard, you'll be overthrown because the people will be furious. If you tax the people too softly, you'll not collect enough taxes to be able to protect your country, or you'll be overthrown by a foreign power because you don't have enough resources set back. So it was kind of an interesting argument. Letter I, do not let the state become highly unequal or allow for a small set of monopolies. And again, this is his idea that you have to sort of take care of the citizens and provide some semblance of equality. And so I think he would look at a state like the United States and say, this is troubling, right? It's way too unequal. And there are quite obviously quite a number of monopolies in our society. And he says that can be the downfall of a society too. J, be very careful of the military taking over, right? We know this for a fact from political science and other theories that the number one um, contender for the sovereignty is the military, right? Under most systems, it's not a civil war, it's not an uprising by the people, it's a military coup. So if you look at the South American state from 1910 to 1970, right? We had all of these military coups. Africa, multiple military coups. Recently, right, the Arab Spring, multiple military coups. Putin recently just reshuffled all the military leadership in his military so that it's a bunch of nobodies in charge now again, so that they can't build up enough loyalty to offer real opposition to Putin's leadership, right? And so this is something that dictators are constantly considering. I have to be very careful about how powerful I allow my military to become, because eventually it could be my own downfall, right? Okay, K. Do not let any one city gain too much political influence. So here he's talking about urban versus rural, and it's important to keep some semblance of equality between the two. And then finally, do not make the spread mistake like Rome and arguably later England itself. Control the territory you can control. If you get too big, you will lose legitimacy. You will have a lot of civil wars. You will not be able to keep people on a single path of this is the best thing for our citizenry, right? Because now you have all these different cultures, all of these different beliefs about what government should look like, what equality should look like, etc. All right, so that's Hobbes. Pretty uh, clearly a lover of monarchy, right? Um, and he doesn't really, he kind of tinily touches on the idea that the state also has obligations to the people. But he just basically talks about what are the obligations of the citizen to the state, right? And so in the next unit, what we'll be talking about is a criticism of Hobbesian philosophy by Jean Jacques Rousseau, who is just an everyday citizen and philosopher and is not sort of tied to the aristocracy. And he offers a scathing criticism. So anyway, thanks so much for being here for Unit 1, and I'll get Unit 2 lectures up ASAP. Have a great day, y'all.